This is not photoshopped. Is this not a stunning view? Can you imagine being there, seeing this, those amazing colors and geography with your own eyes? And can you imagine the undeniable presence of God welling up in your heart? Then sings my soul, how great thou art. You've had that experience somewhere, sometime, haven't you? This is Ireland. Ireland. I don't know what part, but that's such a beautiful, beautiful plateau. There's a word or phrase theologians have for this. It's called natural revelation. When you find God's presence, God's activity, God's reality in the natural world. They call it natural revelation. This is also Ireland. Now imagine yourself a teenager, 16, 17, 18 years old. And you are in this place every day. Long hours, long nights, day after day, week after week, year after year. Can you imagine yourself finding God in this place if you were there? Patrick did. Patrick. Patrick is his old Gaelic name. Modern Gaelic would call him Padraig. You know who we're talking about? Yeah. We call him Saint Patrick in English. He came from the Celtic peoples of those British Isles, the Britons again in England, the Picts in Scotland, and the Scots in Ireland. He was born across the sea from Ireland. All of the story is not known. He did leave his own writings, some of which might be a little questionable. You know how it is when you tell your own story. But he was probably, he was a Briton, Celtic Briton, and he may have been born in that place that we would call Wales today, or maybe the other side of the British Isles. No one's sure, even perhaps in Gaul, which would be what we call France today. But he was born there to a family that was fairly wealthy because his father, Calpurnius, was a Roman tax collector called a decurion. It was not what you wanted to be, because if you came up short on the taxes due, guess who paid them? And so few people wanted to have that role, even though it came with wealth and status. And this is actually a picture of a decurion adding things up for that poor man. Maybe that's a slave, I don't know. It's the decurion seated with all the robes, of course. And he's using a type of an abacus. But Patrick's grandfather was a priest. And it's not surprising because in Roman law there was this little escape clause for a decurion. If you became a priest, you can take the yoke of decurion off and not be responsible for paying the taxes of the people. And so Patrick's grandfather took that option, and his father became the decurion, but his father also did the same thing. And the story goes that Patrick was at some point kidnapped by slave traders. And he was taken to Ireland and sold there to a Druid chieftain named, anybody want to try that old Gaelic? I don't either. Because what you don't want to do is try to pronounce that in English. But that was his name. And he, as the slave owner, sent Patrick to these very, very isolated parts of his lands to herd his cattle. And that's where Patrick spent 6 long years pretty much alone. But it was also where he found God. Because even though he was raised in a Roman Christian family, he was no choir boy. And he was known to run with wild young men. He was known to curse and make fun of the church and its clergy, his own family. But when he found himself far from home and alone and stripped of everything he knew, he found God in the very land. And he found God, yes, in the shamrock. He remembered his catechism, what we would call Sunday school, what he had been taught of the Christian faith, and it all became very real to him in his situation. He said, more and more the love and fear of God came to me, and the faith grew, and my spirit was exercised. I'm going to think about that next time I go running. My spirit was exercised until I was praying up to 100 times every day, and he goes on to say, and almost that many times at night. Sleeping out in the fields. Can you imagine? And one night as he slept in the fields, he had a dream, a vision of someone who came to him and said, look, you are going home. Look, your ship is ready. And when he woke up, it was before dawn, and he got up and he began to walk and run toward the sea. And he just kept going and kept going and kept going, and when he got there, he found a ship. And somehow he finagled his way onto the ship, and it returned him to Britain. He may have gone to Gaul, he may have been in Rome, but we know that he went several places and was trained to become a priest. That's how much he wanted to give his life to God and to God's people. And so he had that training, and he served as a parish priest for many, many years. Just, that could have been the story. Parish priest, rescued slave. But it wasn't. He had another dream at the ripe old age of 48. And trust me, in this age, that was a ripe old age. He had another dream, and this time it was the people who had owned him, the Irish Celts who came in his dream, and they came with letters to him. And as they began to read their letters in his dream, he began to hear their actual voices, the people he knew, and they said, we appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us. Can you imagine? And Patrick heard this as his Macedonian vision, just the same as the Apostle Paul had, the call to go to Macedonia and bring the gospel there. He said, this is my Macedonian call to return to my captors and help them find the God I found in their land. And so he went to the British, he went to the bishops in Britain. There were 4 bishops at that time in Britain, and he went and asked them, would you send me to Ireland to bring the gospel there? And they thought that was probably a good idea, and they asked the Pope, and Pope Celestine I ordained Patrick a bishop and sent him on an apostolic mission to Ireland. They were happy to do this because no one else wanted to go. They sent him there on a ship, and when he arrived not alone, but with a whole entourage of people that he had brought from Britain. And they got there about 432 of the Common Era. And he brought priests, he brought seminarians, those who were, preparing for the priesthood. He brought some nuns, he brought women, he brought craftsmen. He came to settle there, and with people who were willing to settle there. Now the Romans never got, at least the Roman hordes, never got to Ireland, but they had heard about the Irish Celts. And no one thought they had the intellect or the self-discipline to comprehend the Christian faith and practice. And so no one bothered to go there. And they had met some of the warriors. The Celtic warriors were known to be pretty darn crazy. This is a very polite picture because it shows them wearing pants. And yes, thank you to the Irish for pants. No one wore pants until they met the Celts in Ireland. But usually in battle, the Celts wore nothing but their sandals. And they came at you screaming bloody murder, right? So the Romans said, these are barely human beings, and there's no point to taking Christianity to them. That was the attitude. That was the feeling. So they send Patrick, who says, I know these people, and they're people, and I came to love them. He said, I know them from the underside. Isn't that interesting? As a slave, I know them. And so he used that yada. Remember? He used that yada, intimate knowledge, that knowledge that comes from this deep knowing, to connect the Celtic worldview to the understandings of Christian faith. He said, I'm ready to do this. And when his entourage got to Ireland, they had a plan. He had a method. And his method was establishing monasteries all over the island. Not the monasteries that you're thinking of from the much later Middle Ages, not where nuns and priests were in little cells isolated, no. These monasteries were more like what we might call today communes. They would go to an area and they would negotiate with the chieftain for privilege of settling there, and then they would create a big space, a big area, and set up their homes and a chapel, and they would begin to live as a Christian witness in the midst of the Irish Celts. And their lives were very, very different, primarily because there was no violence allowed within the circle of their monastery. Can you imagine? Their primary witness was peace because these were very violent, warring tribes. That's what they did. They went everywhere. These are some of the ruins of the original monasteries. There aren't very many of Patrick's time. And they began to bear witness to Christ. And Patrick was very good about, sharing the Trinity and the shamrock. And they began to create an indigenous Christian movement. Yes, they brought the seeds, but it flourished. And they began to grow. And this is a rendition of Patrick baptizing one of the chieftains, tribal chieftains. And I want to tell you what his metrics were. Was he successful? I think you'd say yes. Personally, he planted at least 55 churches. That means almost as many monasteries. The whole movement in his time planted 700 churches. They ordained 1,000 and trained 1,000 indigenous priests. And during his time, 30 to 40 of the roughly 150 tribes became Christians. I am not, the irony of this particular weekend and this particular sermon coming together is not lost on me. But I want to tell you, all of this work that Patrick did was nearly erased by the Roman popes, because Patrick had a very unique indigenous way of bringing the gospel to these people. And later popes decided this is not the Roman way. This is much too Irish, much too Scot, right? Much too tribal. And so the later popes sent people to come and put everybody in the Roman way. So there is some indigenous Irish Christianity that still exists, but most of what you're hearing on the news right now is the Roman Ireland that people are so deeply, deeply hurt and disappointed in. This is a pilgrimage route. That is one of St. Patrick's route that they took as they went through Ireland establishing the monasteries. And he went, in his writings, he says he went back to Ireland because he so believed that Christians are called to be a light among the nations. Who asked us to be? Jesus. But I love his language. He says, we are called to fish well. To fish well, to spread our nets so that we can catch a great multitude for God. Isn't that beautiful? And he said, for God gave me such grace. He offers it to grace. That many people through me were reborn to God and afterward confirmed and brought to perfection. I'd never seen that word outside of the Wesleyan context. But meaning perfection in love, perfection in nonviolence, perfection in community. Brothers and sisters, until we understand that we are all called in this postmodern world to be missionaries for Christ, we will continue to see our witness imperiled for future generations. I invite you to give thanks to God for those like Patrick. What was it that he had to overcome to go back to his captors? What was it that enabled him to bring love back to them, the love of Christ? Reflect on those things as Pamela leads us in giving thanks.